Welcome. This video tells the story of a man whose battlefield was the human mind, and whose weapon was his words. It is the story of Socrates, his life, his path, and the world that both created and condemned him. In the year 399 BC, within the walls of Athens, a 70-year-old man was condemned to die. The city that passed this judgment was the jewel of the ancient world, a beacon of democracy and philosophy. And yet, this city was also a place living in the shadow of recent trauma. It was still nursing the deep wounds of a humiliating defeat in the long Peloponnesian War, and the memory of the brutal oligarchy of the 30 tyrants that followed was fresh and bitter. The restored democracy was fragile, anxious, and deeply suspicious. It was a city searching for answers, but also for someone to blame for its fall from grace. The charges brought against the old man were severe: disrespect for the gods and the corruption of the young. His name was Socrates. This is not simply the story of a city making a mistake. It is the story of why, at that specific turn of history, it could not have acted otherwise. The Athens of that time was in the twilight of its golden age. High on the rock of the Acropolis, the Parthenon stood as a perfect monument to harmony and power, its marble columns catching the warm light of the Mediterranean sun. It was the centerpiece of a city that saw itself as a living work of art, a place blessed by the gods. Down below, in the sprawling marketplace known as the Agora, the city's heart beat with a vibrant rhythm. This was no ordinary market. It was a place of commerce and politics, of art and argument. Beneath the shade of the stoas, one could hear merchants haggling over the price of olive oil, politicians debating the latest decree, and poets reciting their newest verses. It was here, amongst the artisans and the aristocrats, that the great questions of life were discussed with a passion and freedom that was a marvel of the age. Athens was a city in love with its own brilliance, a place that believed truth was its birthright. Into this crucible of civilization was born a man who would become its conscience, and ultimately its victim. Socrates was a true son of this city. Unlike the traveling teachers known as the Sophists, who journeyed from city to city selling their knowledge, Socrates rarely ever left his home. His loyalty was to Athens and its people. He wrote no books, he sought no office, he commanded no armies. His entire world was contained within the sun-drenched streets and shaded walkways he knew so well. He was a product of the city's celebrated freedom, and he chose to use that freedom to its absolute limit, to question the very values the city held most dear, to see if they were as strong and true as the marble of the Parthenon. He did not look like the other great figures of his day. He owned little, living a life of remarkable austerity, and his face, with its broad nose and prominent eyes, was often compared by his contemporaries to that of a satyr, a creature of the woods. His student, Plato, would later have another character describe him as being like a Silena statue, plain or even ugly on the outside, but when opened up, it revealed a beautiful golden figure of a god within. This contrast between his outer form and his inner world was at the core of his being. When he began to speak, his appearance was forgotten. People were drawn to the relentless, searching quality of his mind. His only tool was reason, his only weapon a question, and in his hands, that simple weapon proved to be more unsettling than any spear. This story is more than the biography of a single man. It is the chronicle of an inevitable clash. It is the tale of how the world's freest city produced a man whose own intellectual freedom became a danger to the state. His path led him from the bloody battlefields of the Peloponnesian War, where he served with distinction as a common soldier, risking his life for the city, to the quiet prison cell where he would face his end. Even as he fought for Athens, he was developing the very habits of mind that the city would one day declare a crime. His life became a quiet indictment of Athenian glory, and his death became the event that would give birth to Western philosophy as we know it. The final scene of his public life took place in a courtroom under the open sky. 501 of his fellow citizens, selected by a random draw, sat as his jury. They were farmers and merchants, craftsmen and veterans. They were the embodiment of Athens, with all its pride and all its fears. And they held the life of this man in their hands. They were there to pass judgment on the one who had spent a lifetime asking them difficult questions. What is justice? What is honor? What does it mean to live a good life? The accusers had spoken, weaving a narrative of danger and subversion. Now a tense silence fell as the old man, dressed in his plain, customary tunic, rose to face them. His entire life had been a preparation for this one final conversation. The life that led to this moment began 70 years earlier, not in an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, but at the very dawn of the city's greatest age. Socrates was born around the year 470 BC, into an Athens brimming with a powerful, almost limitless confidence. The city was still celebrating its improbable victory over the vast Persian Empire. This victory had not just preserved its freedom, it had filled the Athenians with a sense of divine favor and historical destiny. They believed they were exceptional, and they set out to build a city that would reflect that exceptionalism, a city that would become a monument to human potential. This was the world that shaped the young Socrates, a world of unparalleled brilliance and unshakable self-belief. At the heart of this transformation was the statesman Pericles. For over 30 years, he was the city's leading voice, a man whose vision defined the era. Pericles imagined an Athens that was more than just the dominant military power in the Greek world. He famously called the city an education for Greece, envisioning it as a cultural capital, a place where art, philosophy, and political thought would reach their zenith. He championed a radical form of government, democracy. In the Athens of Pericles, political power did not belong to a king or a small council of aristocrats, but to the assembly of male citizens. On a hillside known as the Nix, thousands of ordinary Athenians would gather to debate and vote on all matters of state, from declaring war to raising taxes. Public officials were often chosen not by election, but by a random lottery, based on the belief that any citizen was capable of serving the state. This system fostered an extraordinary sense of civic duty and participation. To be a citizen of Athens was to be an active participant in its destiny. It was an imperfect system, built on the labor of slaves and excluding women and foreigners from its franchise. But for the citizens who took part, it was a thrilling and empowering reality. It created a culture of public speaking and vigorous debate. A man's worth was often measured by his ability to persuade his fellow citizens in the assembly, a skill that placed enormous value on the power of words and argument. This pride and ambition were cast in stone and marble. Pericles initiated one of the most ambitious building projects in history, reconstructing the temples on the Acropolis that had been destroyed by the Persians. Financed by the treasury of the Delian League, an alliance of Greek states that Athens had transformed into its own empire, the city adorned itself with breathtaking structures. The Parthenon rose to honor the goddess Athena, its proportions so perfect they seemed almost divine. The grand gateway of the Propylaea welcomed visitors to the sacred rock. These were not merely religious buildings. They were symbols of Athenian power, piety, and cultural supremacy. Every citizen who looked up at the Acropolis felt a share in that glory. It was a daily reminder that they lived in the greatest city in the world. This explosion of creativity was not limited to architecture. In the great open-air theater of Dionysus, the art of tragedy reached its peak. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides grappled with the most profound questions of human existence: fate, justice, and the relationship between gods and mortals. The theater was a state-sponsored event, a place where the entire community came together to examine its own myths and values. At the same time, the first true historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, began to record human events, seeking rational causes rather than divine whims to explain the past. A new spirit of inquiry was taking hold, a belief that the universe and man's place within it were not just matters of faith, but subjects for rational investigation. This was the inheritance of Socrates. He grew up in a city that was vibrant, wealthy, and intellectually audacious. It was a place that encouraged argument, celebrated beauty, and believed it was on a mission to enlighten the world. The Athenians of the Golden Age were accustomed to asking questions of others, to debating the nature of empires and the actions of their enemies. They were not, however, accustomed to having those questions turned inward upon themselves. They were not prepared for a man who would use the city's own tools of logic and reason to question the very foundations of its glorious self-image. Into this confident, argumentative city came a new kind of teacher, men who promised to provide the tools for success in this demanding democratic world. They arrived from all corners of the Greek-speaking lands, drawn by the wealth and intellectual hunger of Athens. They were known as the Sophists, a name that originally meant wise men or experts. They were the first professional educators, intellectual celebrities who commanded enormous respect and even larger fees. Unlike the philosophers who would follow, they did not belong to a single school of thought, but they shared a common purpose: to teach the practical skills necessary for a successful life, particularly in the political arena. The most famous of them were figures like Protagoras of Abdera, a man of immense learning and prestige; Gorgias of Leontini, a master of rhetorical fireworks who could hold an audience spellbound; and Hippias of Elis, who claimed expertise in virtually every subject imaginable, from mathematics to poetry. These men were a revolutionary force in education. Traditionally, a young Athenian's education consisted of music, gymnastics, and the basic literacy needed to read the laws and the great poets. The Sophists offered something more, something that ambitious young men from wealthy families craved: a higher education designed for worldly success. They taught for a price, a practice that shocked many traditionalists, who believed that knowledge should be shared freely, not sold as a commodity. But the demand for their services was immense. The cornerstone of their curriculum was the art of rhetoric. In a city where major decisions were made by popular assembly and legal disputes were settled by mass juries, the ability to speak persuasively was not a luxury. It was the ultimate source of power. The Sophists taught their students how to construct a compelling argument on any topic, how to organize a speech, how to use emotional appeals, and how to refute an opponent's position. They also claimed to teach arete, a Greek word often translated as virtue or excellence. For them, this was not an abstract moral quality, but the set of skills and characteristics needed to be an effective leader and a successful citizen. It was the virtue of being able to manage one's household, contribute to the city, and win the admiration of one's peers. But beneath these practical lessons lay a radical and deeply unsettling philosophical foundation. At the core of much sophistic thought was the idea of relativism. The great sophist Protagoras captured this in what became his most famous statement: "Man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not." In simple terms, this meant that there is no objective, universal truth that exists independently of human perception. What seems true to one person is true for them. What seems true to another person is true for them. There is no higher court of appeal. This idea had profound implications for morality and law. If there is no absolute truth, then there can be no absolute right and wrong. Justice, piety, and goodness, they argued, were not timeless divine concepts. They were merely social conventions, customs that varied from one city-state to another. What was considered just in Athens might be seen as unjust in Sparta, and neither city could claim to have a monopoly on the truth. This was an incredibly liberating idea for some. It suggested that laws and traditions were not sacred, but were man-made and could therefore be challenged, changed, or manipulated to one's advantage. But for many others, it was a terrifying doctrine. It seemed to dissolve the very glue that held society together, turning morality into a matter of opinion and law into a simple exercise of power. The boast of Gorgias, that he could teach the art of making the weaker argument appear the stronger, seemed to confirm the worst fears of the conservatives. It suggested that the goal of speech was not to discover truth, but merely to win. Thus, the intellectual landscape of Athens became a vibrant and contentious marketplace of ideas. The Sophists offered a path to power and success, armed with rhetorical skill and a philosophy that placed human beings, not gods or abstract principles, at the center of the universe. Their teaching was practical, modern, and perfectly suited to the ambitions of a generation born into an imperial democracy. But while they held court and collected their fees, another kind of thinker was beginning to walk the same streets of the agora. A man who believed with all his being that truth was not relative, and that virtue was not a skill to be purchased, but a state of the soul to be discovered through a lifetime of rigorous and honest self-examination. But the world in which these debates took place, this brilliant, self-assured city of Pericles, was not destined to last. The intellectual confidence of the Golden Age was built upon a foundation of political and military power, and that foundation was about to crack. The shadows of a long and devastating war were gathering on the horizon, a conflict that would test Athens to its breaking point and reshape its very soul. The confident questions of the philosophers would soon be drowned out by the grim realities of battle, starvation, and plague. In 431 BC, the inevitable finally happened. The simmering rivalry between Athens and the grim military city-state of Sparta erupted into open warfare. The Peloponnesian War was more than a struggle for territory. It was a clash of ideologies. It pitted the dynamic, commercial, seafaring democracy of Athens against the rigid, agrarian, land-based oligarchy of Sparta. Pericles' strategy was cautious. He urged the Athenians to avoid confronting the invincible Spartan army on land. Instead, they were to withdraw behind the protection of the Long Walls, a massive fortified corridor connecting Athens to its port of Piraeus, and use their unmatched navy to raid Spartan territory and secure their empire's supply lines. For the first year, the strategy seemed to work. The Athenians were safe within their walls, a fortified island on the mainland. But in the second year of the war, a far more terrifying enemy breached the city's defenses. It was not a Spartan soldier, but a pestilence. The Great Plague of Athens swept through the overcrowded city, whose population had been swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside. The historian Thucydides, who survived it himself, left a chilling account of its effects. The disease was swift, horrific, and incurable. It began with a fever and descended into violent fits of coughing and vomiting, before the body, covered in sores, finally gave out. The city's infrastructure collapsed. Bodies were left unburied in the streets or piled onto massive funeral pyres. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical toll. The plague shattered the Athenians' faith. Their prayers to the gods went unanswered, and the temples became places of death. Social customs and laws dissolved in the face of imminent mortality. Thucydides wrote that people, believing their lives were short and their actions without consequence, gave themselves over to extravagant and reckless pleasures. Why act honorably today if you would be dead tomorrow? The plague wiped out nearly a third of the city's population. Among its victims was Pericles himself. His death in 429 BC left a void that could not be filled. The architect of the Golden Age was gone, and the city he had built was left leaderless in its darkest hour. The leaders who rose to prominence after Pericles were men of a different character. They were demagogues, populist orators like Cleon, who appealed not to reason and foresight, but to the public's rawest emotions: their anger, their grief, and their desire for vengeance. The measured, strategic debate of the Periclean era gave way to a more brutal and impulsive style of politics. The war dragged on year after bloody year, a relentless cycle of raids, sieges, and atrocities, draining the city's treasury and its reserves of manpower. Then, in 415 BC, driven by this new, aggressive political mood, Athens embarked on its greatest and most tragic gamble. The city launched the Sicilian expedition, a massive naval invasion of the island of Sicily, aimed at conquering the powerful city of Syracuse. It was an act of breathtaking hubris, an attempt to expand the empire even as it was fighting for its life against Sparta. The expedition was enormous, the grandest military force ever assembled by a Greek city. Its departure was a spectacle of hope and civic pride. Its end was an unmitigated catastrophe. After 2 years of bitter fighting, the Athenian army was cornered and annihilated. The Athenian fleet was utterly destroyed in the great harbor of Syracuse. Thousands of soldiers were killed or sold into slavery. News of the disaster trickled back to Athens, at first dismissed as impossible rumors. When the full truth was known, a wave of collective despair washed over the city. The Sicilian expedition had been more than a military defeat. It was a psychological breaking point. The city's wealth was gone, the flower of its youth was dead, and its naval supremacy was shattered. The confident, optimistic Athens of Socrates' youth was gone forever. In its place was a city haunted by loss, suspicious of its leaders, and desperate for simple explanations for its profound misfortunes. It was in this climate of fear and recrimination that an old philosopher, who offered only more difficult questions instead of easy answers, would begin to look less like a harmless eccentric and more like a dangerous threat. And the man who would become the focal point for all this civic anxiety was not a general, a wealthy aristocrat, or a powerful politician. He was a stonecutter's son, a man of the people, who had spent his entire life walking the very streets that were now filled with suspicion. To understand how this ordinary citizen became so extraordinary and so dangerous, we must look to his origins, to a philosophy that was shaped not in a lofty academy, but in the humble workshops and homes of working Athenians. Socrates' father was named Sophroniscus, and he was a stonemason, or perhaps a sculptor. He belonged to the respected artisan class, a man who worked with his hands, transforming rough blocks of marble into figures or functional structures. This was a world of tangible skill, of techne, a Greek word for craftsmanship and art. It was a world of patience and precision. A sculptor does not create a statue by adding material, but by taking it away. He must have a vision of the final form that lies hidden within the shapeless stone, and with methodical, careful strikes of his chisel, he removes everything that is not the statue. He chips away the excess, the superficial, to reveal the essential reality that was there all along. This process, the world of his father, became a powerful, unspoken metaphor for the son's life work. Socrates received the standard education of his time: gymnastics to discipline the body, and music and letters to discipline the mind. But his true school was the agora. He spent his days there, not selling wares, but engaging in conversation. And when he spoke with someone, he approached them much like a sculptor approaches a block of stone. A man would confidently declare that he knew what courage was, or what justice was. For him, this belief was a solid, unexamined block of opinion. Socrates would then begin his work. He would not offer a counter-definition or lecture the man on his own beliefs. Instead, he would start to ask simple, incisive questions. Each question was like a tap of the chisel. If courage is standing your ground in battle, is it not sometimes more courageous to retreat strategically and save the army? If justice is giving every man what he is owed, what do we owe an enemy? With each answer, a chip of the man's unthinking assumption would fall away. The original, solid block of opinion would begin to show cracks and inconsistencies. Socrates would continue to chip away, revealing contradictions and hidden flaws, until the man's initial certainty was completely dismantled, leaving him in a state of confusion, a state Socrates called aporia. For many, this was a frustrating and humiliating experience. But for Socrates, this was the essential first step. He had cleared away the rubble of false belief. Only then could the search for the true form, the real definition of the idea, begin. If his father's trade provided the metaphor for the destructive part of his method, his mother's profession gave him the model for the creative part. His mother's name was Phaenarete, and she was a Maya, a midwife. In ancient Greece, this was a crucial and respected role. A midwife did not create the child. The life was already present within the mother. The midwife's skill was to assist in the process of birth, to guide the mother through the labor, to know when to encourage and when to be firm, and to help bring that new life safely into the world. Socrates explicitly and famously described his own work as a kind of intellectual midwifery, an art he called meutics. He insisted that he himself was barren of knowledge, much as a midwife is typically past her own childbearing years. He did not go around the city implanting his own ideas into the empty heads of others. Instead, he claimed to have a gift for recognizing when another person was pregnant with a thought, an idea that was struggling to be born. His role was to be their philosophical midwife. His questions were the tools of his trade. He would help the person articulate their own thoughts, to push through the pains of confusion and contradiction. He would examine the newborn idea to see if it was a true and healthy insight, or what he called a wind egg, a phantom belief without substance. If the idea was false, he would help the person to see its flaws and discard it. But if it was true, he would celebrate its birth, even though the idea was the other person's, not his own. This was the profound difference between Socrates and the Sophists. The Sophists were like merchants who sold prepackaged, imported knowledge. Socrates was a midwife who helped the citizens of Athens deliver their own, homegrown understanding. His entire philosophy was grounded in these two powerful, earthy metaphors from the lives of his parents. He was a sculptor of souls, chipping away the excess to find the truth within. And he was a midwife of the mind, helping others give birth to the wisdom they already possessed. It was a philosophy born of the common people for the common people, and it would ultimately shake the city to its very core. This unique method of conversation was inseparable from the man who practiced it. For the people of Athens, Socrates was not just a disembodied voice asking questions. He was a constant, eccentric, and unavoidable physical presence in their city. His character was as unconventional as his philosophy, a strange mixture of profound self-discipline and bizarre personal habits that made him a figure of both fascination and ridicule. He was a living paradox, and his fellow citizens did not know what to make of him. To begin with, there was his appearance. In a city that prized physical beauty, Socrates was famously plain. His friends and his critics alike described his stout, thick-set body, his upturned nose, and his wide, prominent eyes, which seemed to bulge and look outwards, allowing him, as he joked, to see not just what was in front of him, but what was on either side as well. He cared little for material comforts. While other citizens might wear fine linen tunics and leather sandals, Socrates was almost always seen in the same simple, durable robe, and he walked barefoot through the city in all seasons. Whether the sun was baking the stones of the agora in summer, or a rare frost was covering the ground in winter, his bare feet trod the earth with the same indifference. This striking image, the homely philosopher with bare feet and a worn-out cloak, engaging the city's most handsome and wealthy young men in conversation, became an iconic and enduring picture of Athenian life. This indifference to his surroundings was a sign of his most noted characteristic, his incredible self-control, or enkritia. He seemed to have a complete mastery over his body and its desires. His physical endurance was legendary among those who knew him, especially those who had served with him in the army. He could endure hunger and thirst longer than any other soldier. At drinking parties, known as symposia, he could outdrink everyone present without ever seeming to become intoxicated, and yet he would just as happily drink only water. It was not that he was against pleasure, but rather that he refused to be a slave to it. For Socrates, the body was the instrument of the soul, and it was the soul's duty through reason to remain in command. The appetites for food, drink, comfort, and wealth were distractions from the far more important business of caring for one's soul and seeking wisdom. His life was a constant, lived demonstration of this core philosophical belief. Perhaps the strangest of his personal habits were the episodes in which he would fall into deep, motionless trances. Friends and acquaintances reported that Socrates would sometimes, in the middle of a walk or a conversation, simply stop. He would stand perfectly still, his gaze fixed on nothing, completely absorbed in his own thoughts, utterly oblivious to the world around him. These spells could last for minutes or, in one famous case, for an entire day and night. The politician and general Alcibiades, in Plato's Symposium, tells the story of one such event during the military campaign at Potidea. One morning, Socrates began to think about a problem and stood still, pondering. He remained in the same spot all day. As evening fell, other soldiers, amazed and curious, brought their sleeping mats out to watch him. He stood there through the entire night under the stars until the sun rose the next morning. Only then did he offer a prayer to the sun and walk away, as if nothing had happened. This was a man whose powers of concentration were almost superhuman. Adding to his aura of strangeness was what Socrates himself called his daimonion, or his divine sign. This was a private, inner voice that he claimed had been with him since childhood. He described it not as a source of positive commands, but as a purely prohibitive force. The voice never told him what to do, but it would often, and with unerring accuracy, warn him against a course of action he was about to take. It might stop him from engaging in a certain political discussion, or from conversing with a particular person. It was not a god to be worshipped, but an intensely personal, spiritual guide, a kind of divine instinct that protected him from error. This was a deeply mysterious thing to his fellow Athenians. In a city with a public religion of gods and oracles, this private, uncommanding voice set Socrates apart, and it would later be twisted by his accusers into a charge of him inventing new private gods. Through this combination of a plain appearance, iron self-discipline, bizarre trances, and a mysterious inner voice, Socrates became one of Athens's most famous and recognizable characters. He was the talk of the town, a man so unique that he could be effectively satirized on the comic stage. Decades before his trial, the great playwright Aristophanes wrote his comedy The Clouds, which featured a ridiculous caricature of Socrates hanging in a basket, spouting nonsense. He was a fixture of the city, an institution. But as the fortunes of Athens declined, the city's affection for its beloved eccentric would begin to sour, and his strangeness would start to look less like a charming quirk and more like a dangerous deviation from the norm. While this strange and brilliant man made the entire city of Athens his stage, there was another part of his life, a private world that was equally challenging and, in its own way, unconventional. Socrates, the public philosopher who engaged in conversation with all of Athens, was also a husband and a father, and the story of his marriage to his wife, Xanthippe, has become almost as legendary and as misunderstood as the man himself. Through centuries of anecdotes, her name has become a byword for a nagging, sharp-tongued, and difficult spouse, the shrew who tormented a sage. But the truth, as is so often the case, is likely far more complex. Xanthippe was significantly younger than Socrates, and together they had 3 sons. The popular image of her comes from a series of stories, told by later writers, that paint her as a woman of a fearsome temper. In the most famous anecdote, a frustrated Xanthippe, after scolding her husband to no effect, either threw a bucket of water or emptied a chamber pot over his head. Socrates, dripping, is said to have calmly remarked to his amused friends, "After the thunder comes the rain." In another story, he is seen being physically chased from the house by his wife. These tales cemented her reputation as the archetypal shrew, a constant source of domestic misery for the serene philosopher. But it is worth pausing to consider the world from Xanthippe's perspective. What was it truly like to be married to Socrates? He was a man who deliberately rejected the fundamental responsibilities of a conventional Athenian husband. He did not practice a trade to earn a steady income for his family. While his father had been a respectable artisan, Socrates spent his days in the agora, not working but talking. He famously refused to accept any payment for his philosophical conversations, believing that to do so would be a kind of prostitution of wisdom. While this may have been a noble philosophical stance, for the woman tasked with managing the household, feeding and clothing their 3 sons, it was likely a source of constant and immense practical stress. Furthermore, his mission, as he saw it, was to care for the souls of his fellow citizens. This divine calling consumed him entirely. His focus was on the abstract virtues of justice and piety, not on the mundane but necessary details of domestic life. Their home was said to be constantly filled with his admirers, wealthy and aristocratic young men who would follow him for hours, captivated by his intellect. But it would have been Xanthippe who had to deal with the reality of this following, a house full of guests to host, with little or no resources to do so. Her supposed anger and frustration, seen through this lens, begin to look less like the ravings of a shrew and more like the entirely understandable reactions of a woman left to manage the impossible practicalities of living with a saint. Socrates himself seemed to acknowledge her fiery spirit, but he viewed it not as a burden, but as a peculiar kind of spiritual training. His friend and student Xenophon recounts a conversation in which Socrates was asked why he chose to live with such a difficult woman. Socrates replied with an analogy. He said that those who wish to become expert horsemen do not choose the most placid and docile horses for their practice. They choose the most spirited and fiery steeds. For if they can learn to master a difficult horse, they can handle any other horse with ease. In the same way, Socrates explained, he lived with Xanthippe because if he could learn to cultivate patience and self-control with her, he could then easily get along with anyone else in the world. It was a backhanded compliment, to be sure, but it revealed that he saw her formidable nature not as a flaw, but as a challenge that honed his own philosophical virtue. But perhaps the most telling glimpse into their relationship, the one that cuts through all the caricature and comedy, comes from Plato's account of Socrates' final day. When his friends arrive at the prison in the morning, they find Xanthippe already there with her husband, holding their youngest child in her arms. She is not scolding him. She is utterly distraught. Upon seeing his friends, she cries out in grief, "Oh, Socrates, this is the last time you and your friends will speak to one another." Her sorrow is so overwhelming that Socrates, with his usual calm, asks his friend Crito to have someone escort her home. She is led away, weeping bitterly and beating her chest in a raw display of grief. This is not the action of a woman who hated her husband. It is the raw pain of a wife who, despite a lifetime of difficulty and the immense challenges of being married to a man who belonged more to the world than to her, was now facing his loss. It reveals the complex, perhaps even loving bond that existed beneath the surface of their famously difficult life together. Xanthippe was not merely a footnote of frustration in a great man's story. She was a woman faced with the daily human reality of living with a genius who was, in almost every sense, not of this world. But the life of Socrates was not confined to the challenges of the home or even to the intellectual contests of the agora. Long before he was widely known as Athens's great questioner, he was known to his comrades as a soldier. Like every able-bodied Athenian citizen between the ages of 18 and 59, he was called upon to serve the city in times of war. And on the battlefield, the philosopher's abstract commitment to virtue was tested by the brutal and immediate reality of combat. It was here, amidst the clash of bronze and the cries of men, that his legendary self-mastery was put on display not for a few curious friends, but for an entire army to witness. To understand Socrates the soldier, one must first understand the nature of Greek warfare. The heart of the Athenian army was the Hoplite infantry. A hoplite was a citizen soldier, armed with a long spear and a large, heavy circular shield called a hoplon. They fought in a tightly packed formation called a phalanx, a human wall of shields and spears. Success in the phalanx depended not on individual heroics, but on collective discipline and courage. Each man had to hold his position, protecting the man to his left with his shield, trusting that the man on his right was protecting him. It was a terrifying, claustrophobic, and physically demanding form of combat that required immense strength, stamina, and an unwavering resolve. Socrates served in at least 3 major campaigns during the Peloponnesian War. His first notable service was at the siege of Potidea, a city in northern Greece that had revolted against Athenian rule in 432 BC. The siege was one of the opening acts of the Great War with Sparta. It was a long, arduous, and costly campaign. The Athenian army was bogged down for over 2 years, facing not only a determined enemy but also the harsh conditions of the region, including a brutal winter. It was during this campaign that Socrates' comrades first became aware of his extraordinary physical and mental fortitude. The stories of his endurance were told for years afterward, most famously by Alcibiades, who served alongside him. During the severe winter, while young soldiers wrapped themselves in extra layers of felt and sheepskin to ward off the biting cold, Socrates wore only his usual thin tunic. Most astonishingly, he walked barefoot on the ice and frozen earth, seemingly unaffected by the frost that tormented his well-shod companions. This was not a display of arrogance, but a simple expression of his complete indifference to physical hardship. He ate and drank whatever rations were available with neither complaint nor excess. His powers of endurance were so remarkable that they shamed many of the younger, more athletic men, who could only marvel at this strange, middle-aged man's resilience. But his strength was not merely passive. It was matched by his courage in the heat of battle. Alcibiades recounts a fierce skirmish during the siege where the Athenian lines came under heavy attack. In the chaos of the fighting, the young and brilliant Alcibiades was wounded and fell to the ground, vulnerable to the enemy. In that moment, when the instinct for self-preservation would have caused most to flee, Socrates did the opposite. He stood his ground, straddling the fallen body of his young friend. He used his heavy shield as a bulwark, defending both Alcibiades and himself from the enemy's attack, holding the position with unshakable resolve until the danger had passed and they could both retreat to safety. He had saved the life of the man who would go on to become one of Athens's most famous and controversial leaders. The story does not end there. In the aftermath of the battle, the Athenian generals, recognizing his exceptional bravery, wanted to award Socrates the Aristia, the prize for outstanding valor in combat. It was the highest military honor a soldier could receive. But Socrates refused it. In a remarkable act of humility and mentorship, he went before the generals and argued passionately that the award should be given not to him, but to the young aristocrat whose life he had just saved. He insisted that Alcibiades, with his high birth and political ambitions, would benefit more from the honor. He had no need for medals or public recognition. His only concern was doing the right thing and nurturing the potential for virtue in others. In this single campaign at Potidea, Socrates demonstrated the full spectrum of his character. The physical toughness of a warrior, the courage of a hero, and the selfless virtue of a true philosopher. His service at Potidea revealed a man of immense physical and moral strength. But it is often said that the true test of a soldier's character comes not during the grinding endurance of a long siege, but in the chaotic heart of a decisive battle, especially one that ends in disaster. The true measure of courage is not how one advances, but how one retreats. Years after Potidea, in 424 BC, Socrates would face this very test in the dusty fields of Boeotia, during one of the Athenian army's most calamitous defeats of the entire war. The Battle of Delium would demonstrate that his bravery was not a fluke, but a deeply ingrained part of his philosophical being. The battle was the result of a bold Athenian attempt to establish a fortified base in Boeotia, the territory controlled by Athens's bitter rival, Thebes. An Athenian army, thousands of hoplites strong, marched into the region and seized the sanctuary of Apollo at Delium. The Thebans and their Boeotian allies quickly amassed their own army to confront them. The two forces met on a plain between the sanctuary and the city of Tanagra. Socrates, now a man in his mid-40s, stood in the phalanx among his fellow citizens, his heavy shield on his arm and his spear in his hand, ready to fight for his city once again. The battle began well for the Athenians. Their phalanx charged and managed to break through the enemy's left wing. For a moment, victory seemed within their grasp. But the Theban general, a man named Pagondas, was a brilliant and innovative tactician. He had deployed his own hoplites on the right wing in an unusually deep formation, 25 ranks deep, creating a massive, almost unstoppable block of men. And he had hidden a squadron of cavalry behind a hill. At the critical moment, just as the Athenian left was faltering, Pagondas unleashed his cavalry in a surprise attack on their flank. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Athenian flank collapsed, and that collapse cascaded through the entire army. Order disintegrated, and the advance turned into a panicked, desperate rout. For a hoplite, a rout was the most terrifying and disgraceful experience imaginable. The discipline of the phalanx dissolved into a frantic scramble for individual survival. Men threw away their heavy, cumbersome shields, an act of ultimate shame, to run faster. It was in this moment of pure animal panic that Socrates' character once again shone with an extraordinary light. Two of his friends, Alcibiades, who was serving in the cavalry, and the general Laches, who was also a hoplite, later gave accounts of his conduct. While the army around him was fleeing in terror, Socrates did not run. He retreated with a calm, deliberate, and orderly pace. Alcibiades, watching from horseback, said he saw Socrates and Laches retreating together. He noted that Socrates walked away from the battle with the same unhurried and confident air that he had when he walked through the streets of Athens. He moved with a distinctive swagger, stalking like a pelican, as Alcibiades colorfully put it, his head held high. He darted his eyes from side to side, calmly assessing the situation, making it perfectly clear to any pursuing enemy that he was not an easy or panicked target. His very demeanor was a form of defense. He communicated a readiness to stand and fight if challenged, and so the enemy horsemen, eager to cut down the easier prey who were running with their backs turned, simply left him alone. He was not merely saving himself. The general Laches had become separated from his troops and was in a state of confusion. Socrates stayed with him, his own calm composure providing a shield of confidence for the distraught general. He refused to abandon a comrade in the chaos. Together, the two men walked safely away from a battlefield where so many others, in their panic, had been cut down. This was not the blind fury of a berserker, nor the reckless bravado of a man seeking glory. This was the courage of a philosopher. Socrates had spent his life in pursuit of self-knowledge and self-control. He understood the nature of fear, but he did not allow it to govern his actions. For him, the greatest evil was not to die, but to act unjustly or without virtue, to flee in terror, to abandon a friend, to disgrace oneself by throwing away one's shield. These were injuries to the soul, far more permanent and terrible than any wound the enemy could inflict upon the body. His orderly retreat from Delium was a physical manifestation of his most profound belief, that a man who has examined his life and knows what is truly good has nothing to fear. It was a lesson in courage, delivered not in a quiet conversation in the agora, but in the midst of a terrifying rout. This courage, the calm resolve to do the right thing in the face of mortal danger, was a quality Socrates carried from the battlefield back into the civic heart of Athens. But the next enemy he would face would not be a disciplined phalanx of Thebans. It would be a far more unpredictable and dangerous foe, an angry, grieving mob of his own fellow citizens. The next great test of his character would not require a shield and spear, but a firm commitment to the rule of law. in a moment when the law itself was about to be swept away by a tide of collective hysteria. The year was 406 BC. The Peloponnesian War had been raging for a quarter of a century, and Athens was exhausted and desperate. In a massive naval engagement off the Arginusi Islands, a hastily assembled and largely inexperienced Athenian fleet won a stunning and unexpected victory over the Spartans. The news was met with jubilation in Athens. It seemed a miraculous turning point. But the joy was short-lived. Immediately following the battle, a violent storm descended upon the region, making it impossible for the Athenian commanders to launch their triremes to rescue the sailors from the 25 ships that had been sunk or disabled in the fighting. Thousands of Athenian citizens, clinging to the wreckage of their vessels, were lost to the sea. When the full story reached Athens, joy curdled into a citywide outpouring of grief and then into a venomous rage. The initial celebration was forgotten, replaced by the anguish of thousands of families who had lost sons, husbands, and brothers. Demagogues and the political enemies of the victorious generals saw an opportunity. They stoked the public's anger, demanding a scapegoat for the tragedy. The 8 generals who had just delivered Athens its greatest victory in years were recalled to the city to face the fury of the people. They were blamed for failing to rescue the survivors, their explanations about the storm drowned out by cries for retribution. In the assembly, a proposal was put forward that was as shocking as it was illegal. The motion called for all 8 generals to be tried together, in a single trial, and for the assembly to pass judgment on all of them with a single collective vote. This was a flagrant violation of one of the most sacred principles of Athenian law, which guaranteed every citizen the right to an individual trial and a separate defense. It was a motion born of hysteria, a demand for mob justice, not legal due process. By an extraordinary twist of fate, Socrates was on that day performing his civic duty as a member of the Prytaneus, the rotating 50-man committee that presided over the assembly's meetings. Each day, one member of the committee was chosen by lot to serve as the epistats, the chairman for that single 24-hour period. On the day of this fateful debate, the lot had fallen to Socrates. It was his sworn duty to ensure that the proceedings were conducted according to the law and to put only legal motions to a vote. The atmosphere in the assembly was electric with rage. The crowd roared its approval for the illegal trial. Orators whipped them into a frenzy, calling any opposition an act of treason. The other members of the presiding committee were intimidated, terrified of the mob's anger, and they were prepared to let the illegal vote proceed. But when the motion was formally put forward, one man refused to allow it. Socrates, acting as chairman, declared that the proposal was unlawful and that he would not, under any circumstances, violate his oath of office by putting it to a vote. The reaction was explosive. The crowd turned its fury on him. Threats and insults rained down. Orators screamed that he should be tried right alongside the generals. He was one man, armed only with his conviction, standing against the rage of thousands. He did not flinch. While others buckled under the immense pressure, Socrates stood as a rock of principle against the tide of emotion. For him, the law was not a matter of convenience, to be suspended when it was unpopular. It was the very soul of the city, the only thing that separated a democracy from a tyranny, including the tyranny of the majority. His term as chairman lasted only for that one day. The next day, with a different chairman in place, the other officials yielded to the mob's continued pressure. The illegal trial went forward. The 6 generals who were present in Athens were found guilty and that same day executed. But Socrates' act of defiance was not forgotten. A short time later, the Athenian people, having come to their senses, were overcome with regret for their actions. They turned on the demagogues who had misled them, and the officials who had allowed the illegal vote were themselves put on trial. Socrates' lonely stand was remembered as a moment of profound moral courage, a demonstration that his loyalty was not to popular opinion, but to the abstract and enduring principles of justice and law. His stand against the mob demonstrated an unwavering commitment to the lawful processes of the democracy. But the political fortunes of Athens were violent and unpredictable. The city, weakened by decades of war, was about to swing from the excesses of a panicked majority to the opposite extreme, the iron fist of a brutal dictatorship. And once again, Socrates would be confronted with an unlawful order. Once again, he would be forced to choose between his principles and his life, proving that his courage was not attached to any single form of government, but to justice itself. In 404 BC, after 27 years of grueling warfare, Athens finally surrendered to Sparta. The city's great defensive walls were torn down to the sound of celebratory music from the victorious Spartan army. The Athenian Empire was dismantled, and its celebrated democracy was abolished. In its place, Sparta imposed a puppet government, an oligarchy of 30 Athenian aristocrats, some of whom had long been hostile to the democratic constitution. They would go down in history under the infamous name of the 30 Tyrants. Their rule, though it lasted less than a year, was a reign of terror. Led by a brilliant but ruthless man named Critias, who, in a fateful twist, had once been an associate of Socrates, the 30 set about systematically eliminating their political opponents. They suspended the laws, employed a network of informants, and executed hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 citizens without trial. Their property was confiscated to enrich the regime. A climate of intense fear gripped the city. Citizens who had once spoken freely in the assembly now looked over their shoulders in the street, trusting no one. Many thousands fled into exile. It was in this atmosphere of terror that the 30 sought to consolidate their power, not just by eliminating enemies, but by making respected citizens complicit in their crimes. One day, Socrates and 4 other men were summoned to the Tholos, the government's circular council chamber. There, they were given a direct and unambiguous command from the tyrants. They were ordered to go to the nearby island of Salamis, arrest a wealthy and respected citizen named Leon, and bring him back to Athens. The purpose of the arrest was clear to everyone. Leon was to be summarily executed, and his fortune was to be seized by the 30. The order was a test of loyalty and an attempt to stain the hands of these 5 men with the regime's blood. For the 4 other men in the room, the choice was a simple, brutal calculation of survival. To disobey a direct order from the 30 meant certain death. Terrified, they accepted the mission and set out for the port to take a boat to Salamis. But Socrates did not go with them. In what was perhaps the purest act of civil disobedience in his life, he offered no grand speech of defiance. He did not attempt to rally a resistance. He simply finished the meeting, and while the other 4 went to the harbor to commit a judicial murder, Socrates turned in the opposite direction and walked quietly home. This was not a small act. It was a direct and conscious refusal to obey the highest authority in the state. Socrates knew perfectly well that this act should have cost him his life. As he would later state at his own trial, he fully expected to be arrested and executed for his disobedience. He survived only by a stroke of luck. Shortly after this incident, the democratic exiles who had been gathering outside of Athens launched a successful rebellion, overthrowing the 30 tyrants and restoring the democracy. It was the swift collapse of the regime, not a pardon from the tyrants, that saved him. His action was a perfect illustration of his most fundamental ethical principle. Throughout his life, Socrates had argued that the greatest harm a man could suffer was not pain, or poverty, or even death. The greatest harm was to damage one's own soul by committing an act of injustice. For him, to participate in the arrest and murder of an innocent man like Leon would have been to voluntarily corrupt his own character, to inflict an incurable wound upon his soul. Faced with the choice of either suffering an injustice, being executed by the state, or committing one, becoming an agent of the state's murderous policy, the choice was obvious. He would rather die with a clear conscience than live as an accomplice to a crime. In 2 of the city's greatest crises, Socrates had now been tested by the 2 extremes of political power. In the case of the generals, he had defied the will of a lawless democratic mob. Now, in the case of Leon of Salamis, he had defied the command of a lawless dictatorship. His actions proved that he was not a partisan of either democracy or oligarchy. His ultimate loyalty was to a higher law of justice and morality. This profound independence made him an admirable figure, but in a city scarred by war and torn by factional hatred, it also made him a deeply isolated one, a man who belonged to no party, and who could therefore be claimed by none as a friend, and by all as a potential enemy. This man, who had proven he could not be governed by mobs or by tyrants, lived by an internal compass of his own. His life, a course of private conviction and public duty, was about to be given a new, singular, and all-consuming focus. An event would take place that would transform Socrates from a citizen who practiced philosophy into a man who believed he was on a holy mission from a god. This mission would explain the relentless questioning that defined his later years, and it began not with an argument in Athens, but with a journey made by a friend to the most sacred place in the ancient world. In the rugged mountains of central Greece, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, lay the sanctuary of Delphi. This was the home of the oracle, the spiritual center of the Greek world, considered by many to be the literal navel of the earth. Here, in the temple of the god Apollo, a priestess known as the Pythia would enter a trance-like state and deliver pronouncements that were believed to be the words of the god himself. Kings and generals, city-states and common farmers, all made the difficult pilgrimage to Delphi to ask for guidance on matters of the greatest importance. The oracle's answers were famously cryptic, often wrapped in riddles and ambiguities that required careful interpretation, but they were treated with the utmost reverence. No one in the Greek world would lightly dismiss a clear statement from the Pythia. One of Socrates' most devoted and enthusiastic friends was a man named Chaerephon. He was known for his passionate and somewhat impetuous nature. Full of admiration for the teacher who had so profoundly shaped his own thinking, Chaerephon made the journey to Delphi. Once there, standing before the sacred oracle, he dared to ask a question that was both simple and breathtakingly bold. He did not ask about the outcome of a battle or the founding of a city. He asked the god a question about his friend. As Plato recounts it, Chaerephon asked the Pythia, "Is any man living wiser than Socrates?" The response that came from the priestess was, for the Delphic oracle, uncharacteristically direct and clear. The Pythia declared that no man was wiser. When Chaerephon returned to Athens and eagerly told Socrates the news, the philosopher's reaction was not one of pride or satisfaction. It was one of profound and immediate confusion. This moment, more than any other, was the catalyst for the final, most famous, and most fatal phase of Socrates' life. He was completely bewildered. He would later describe his reaction in his speech at his trial, explaining to the jurors his state of mind. He thought to himself, "What in the world can the god be saying? For I am very conscious that I am not wise at all. What then does he mean by declaring me to be the wisest?" Socrates found himself in a state of deep aporia, the very same state of perplexed confusion into which he so often led his conversation partners. He was faced with a divine paradox. On the one hand, he knew with certainty that he was not wise. He possessed no expert knowledge of craftsmanship like a potter or a shipbuilder, no soaring inspiration like a poet, no confident political theories like a statesman. His most defining characteristic was an acute awareness of his own ignorance. On the other hand, he also believed that the god Apollo could not be lying or mistaken. The words of the oracle had to be true. Therefore, he concluded, the god must not be making a simple statement of fact, but was instead presenting him with a riddle. And as a pious man, he felt he had a sacred duty to investigate the meaning of this divine puzzle. His quest would not be an arrogant attempt to prove the oracle right, but a humble and relentless investigation to understand what the god truly meant. This conviction set him on a new path. He would no longer simply converse with those who happened to cross his path in the agora. He would now actively seek out those citizens of Athens who had the greatest reputation for wisdom, in order to test the god's pronouncement. His plan was simple. If he could find a man who was demonstrably wiser than he was, he could then go to the oracle with evidence and say, "Here is a man who is wiser than I am, but you said I was the wisest." This, he believed, would refute the literal meaning of the statement and perhaps reveal its deeper hidden truth. And so his mission began. As he later recounted, he went first to one of the city's most prominent politicians, a man who was thought to be wise by many, and who, most of all, thought himself to be wise. The Gadfly of Athens was about to begin his work in earnest, not out of arrogance, but out of a perplexing and deeply felt sense of religious duty. And so, guided by his sense of pious duty, Socrates began his investigation. He approached the first man on his list, a politician of great renown, a statesman whose speeches in the assembly were widely admired, and who was considered by the entire city, and most especially by himself, to be a paragon of wisdom. Socrates did not approach him as a challenger, but with his characteristic feigned humility, as a student seeking instruction. He explained his own confusion about the nature of a concept like justice, or piety, or the good, and asked the great man to enlighten him. The politician, flattered and confident, was happy to oblige. He offered a confident, conventional definition. Socrates then began his gentle, methodical questioning. Each question seemed simple and reasonable on its own, and the politician answered them easily. But Socrates was carefully laying out a chain of logic. Slowly but surely, he led the statesman to a conclusion that flatly contradicted his original statement. He had shown the man, using the man's own admissions, that his beliefs were incoherent. The politician, who had begun the conversation full of self-assurance, was left speechless, confused, and deeply resentful. He had been publicly exposed, not by another man's opinion, but by his own flawed thinking. As Socrates walked away from this first encounter, the meaning of the oracle's words began to dawn on him. He thought to himself, "Well, I am certainly wiser than this man. It is true that neither of us knows anything truly beautiful and good, but there is a difference between us. He knows nothing, but thinks that he knows, whereas I, knowing nothing, am also aware that I know nothing. So it seems that in this one small respect I am wiser than he, because I do not think I know what I do not know." This was the profound insight at the heart of Socratic wisdom. It was not a claim to superior knowledge, but a claim to a superior awareness of his own ignorance. He continued his mission, determined to see if this pattern held true. He went to the great poets, the men who wrote the sublime tragedies and hymns that were the pride of Athens. He asked them to explain the meaning of some of their most beautiful and profound passages. He found, to his astonishment, that the poets themselves were the least able to explain their own work. They created their masterpieces, he concluded, not from knowledge or wisdom, but from a kind of natural talent or divine inspiration, like prophets or seers. They were channels for a wisdom they did not personally possess or understand. Finally, he went to the skilled craftsmen, the artisans of the city. Here, at last, he found men who possessed real, demonstrable knowledge. A shoemaker knew how to make shoes. A carpenter knew how to work with wood. Socrates freely admitted that he knew nothing of their crafts and that in this respect, they were far wiser than he. But these men, he discovered, made the same error as the politician, only in reverse. Because they possessed a genuine expertise in their own particular craft, they fell into the fatal assumption that they were also wise in all other matters of the greatest importance, such as how to govern a city or how to live a virtuous life. And this unfounded arrogance, he concluded, ultimately overshadowed their practical wisdom. After this long and disheartening investigation, Socrates finally understood the riddle of the god. The oracle's statement that no man was wiser than he was not a compliment. It was a lesson for all of humankind. The god was using Socrates as an example to make a point. Human wisdom, in the grand scheme of things, is worth little or nothing. True wisdom belongs to the gods alone. The wisest among mortals is any person who, like Socrates, has come to recognize that he truly knows nothing of importance. His mission was now clear to him. He was not meant to simply understand the oracle for himself, but to live out its meaning in the service of the god and his city. He was to be a living reminder to his fellow citizens of their own intellectual complacency. He later used a famous metaphor to describe this role. He compared the city of Athens to a great and noble horse, a thoroughbred that, due to its size and power, had grown sluggish and lazy, in need of being stirred into life. He, Socrates, was the gadfly, a stinging insect sent by the god to attach itself to this great horse, to bite and irritate it, to keep it from falling into a dull and thoughtless sleep. His work, as he saw it, was a service. He was waking his fellow Athenians up, forcing them to care for their most precious possession. Not their wealth or their reputation, but the state of their souls. But the horse does not thank the gadfly for its sting. The powerful men whom Socrates publicly revealed to be ignorant did not thank him for his lesson in humility. His relentless questioning, born of a pious duty to a god, earned him no gratitude. Instead, it generated a slow-burning fire of resentment and hatred among the most influential men in Athens. This holy mission, the quest to understand Apollo's riddle, was the very activity that would one day be twisted into the criminal charges of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. To understand why Socrates' mission created such intense hostility, one must look more closely at the specific tool he used. His method of conversation was not a simple chat or a friendly debate. It was an intellectual weapon of unparalleled precision, a systematic strategy for dismantling a person's most cherished beliefs right before their very eyes. This process, known as the Socratic method, was a two-act drama designed to clear away the dead wood of false opinion before any new growth could begin. The first act, and perhaps the most famous, was the use of what is now called Socratic irony. This was not the sarcasm or mockery that we associate with the word today. It was a carefully crafted posture of feigned ignorance. Socrates would approach a man reputed for his wisdom not as an equal or a challenger, but as a humble, confused student who sincerely needed guidance. His entire demeanor was one of deference. "O Euthyphro," he might say to a priest, "you who are an expert in religious matters, please teach me, for I am ignorant. What exactly is piety?" This stance had a powerful twofold effect. First, it immediately disarmed his conversation partner. The man, being addressed as a great authority, would feel flattered. His ego would be stroked, and he would become eager to display his supposed knowledge, letting his intellectual guard down. Second, this position of humility gave Socrates a unique kind of freedom. It allowed him to ask the most basic, fundamental questions, the kind of simple questions that a supposed equal might be too embarrassed to ask for fear of looking foolish. By presenting himself as the most ignorant man in the room, he gained the license to question everything, starting from the very beginning. Once the irony had set the stage and his partner had confidently offered an initial definition of a concept, the second act of the drama would begin. This was the engine of the Socratic method, a process the Greeks called the elenchus, which can be translated as cross-examination or refutation. This was a meticulous, logical siege on the definition that had been provided. Socrates would begin a series of short, incisive questions, each one designed to seem simple and inoffensive. Let us imagine a conversation in the agora with a respected citizen. Let's call him Polemarch, a man known for his firm convictions. Socrates, in his usual ironic fashion, might begin, "Polemarch, you who have served the city and understand virtue, help me with my ignorance. I often hear people speak of justice. Could you tell me what it is?" Polemarch, flattered, would likely offer a common and honorable-sounding definition. Of course, Socrates. Justice is simple. It is a matter of helping one's friends and harming one's enemies. This definition becomes the fortress to be tested. Socrates does not attack it head-on. He begins his probing questions. That seems a fine answer, Polemarch. But tell me this. Is it possible for us to be mistaken about who our friends and enemies truly are? Can we sometimes think a man is our friend when he is actually an enemy, or vice versa? Being a reasonable man, Polemarch would have to admit, yes, Socrates, that is certainly possible. Socrates would then continue, his questions building one upon the other. Well then, if a man makes such a mistake and he follows your definition of justice, he will end up helping his real enemy, thinking he is a friend, and harming his real friend, thinking he is an enemy. Would you say that is a just outcome? Trapped by his own logic, Polemarch would be forced to concede. No, that would clearly be an injustice. The first crack in the fortress has appeared. Socrates presses on. And tell me another thing. When we harm a horse, does it become a better or a worse horse in its specific virtue as a horse? It becomes worse, of course, Polemarch would reply. And when we harm a dog, does it become a better or a worse dog? Worse also. Socrates would then ask the final, devastating question. So, can we say that when we harm a human being, even an enemy, that person becomes better or worse in their specific virtue as a human being? Reluctantly, Polemarch would have to admit that harming a person makes them worse, more unjust. Then can a just man, Socrates would conclude, through the act of justice, make another man unjust? It seems impossible. At this point, Polemarch would fall silent. His definition, which had seemed as solid as the marble of the Parthenon, has been completely demolished. He has been proven wrong, not by Socrates' opinion, but by his own admissions. He is now in the state of aporia, a state of profound intellectual confusion and discomfort. This is the sting of the gadfly. For Socrates, this painful moment was the noble goal. It was the necessary purge of the soul, the cleansing of the mind from the poison of false certainty. But for the men he questioned, it was often a public humiliation, an infuriating experience that left them feeling foolish and resentful. And it was this resentment, multiplied over years and across the city's most powerful circles, that was slowly sealing his fate. This moment of intellectual collapse, this painful state of aporia, was where most of Socrates' public conversations ended in anger and resentment. For the men he questioned, it felt like a humiliating public defeat, a deliberate effort to make them look foolish. But for Socrates himself, this was never the ultimate goal. The destruction of false certainty was not an end in itself. It was merely the clearing of the ground. It was the necessary and often painful preparation for the second and far more important phase of his work, the constructive art he claimed to have learned from his mother. This was the art of meutics, the skill of the intellectual midwife. Socrates held a firm conviction that stood in stark opposition to the methods of the Sophists. He did not believe that knowledge could be poured from one person's mind into another's, like water from a full jug into an empty one. The Sophists treated knowledge as a commodity they possessed and could sell to their students. Socrates believed that genuine understanding was not something that could be passively received. It had to be actively discovered, and its seeds were already present, lying dormant, within every human soul. Just as his mother Phaenarete did not create the baby she delivered, Socrates insisted that he did not create the ideas his partners came to understand. His role, as he saw it, was to help them give birth to their own insights. After the sharp, logical demolition of the elenchus had done its work, the tone of a Socratic conversation would ideally shift. Once the other person had been forced to admit, "Socrates, I don't know what I am talking about," the adversarial nature of the dialogue would soften. Socrates would cease to be the relentless interrogator and would become a partner in a shared predicament. This was the moment of his great invitation to philosophy. He would often say something to the effect of, "Look, it now appears that neither of us knows what justice truly is. But are we not in a better position now than we were before? Previously you thought you knew, and were content with your ignorance. I knew I was ignorant from the start. Now we are both aware of our ignorance. Let us, therefore, begin a new joint investigation to discover what it might be." This was the beginning of the maieutic process. The questions would become less about refutation and more about exploration. He would encourage the person to formulate a new, better definition, born from the ashes of their previous certainty. Socrates would then act as a gentle guide, a sounding board for these newborn ideas. He would help his partner examine the new thought. Is it a strong and healthy insight consistent with your other beliefs? Or is it what he called a wind egg, a phantom, an idea that seems plausible but is ultimately empty and without substance? This process was a profound act of intellectual respect. He was not telling his partner what to think. He was helping them to think for themselves, more clearly and more honestly than they had before. In this way, the complete Socratic method can be seen as a form of therapy for the soul. The ancient Greeks called this therapia psyches, the care and healing of one's inner self. For Socrates, the soul's greatest sicknesses were arrogance, delusion, and the unthinking acceptance of conventional beliefs. The elenchus, the cross-examination, was the painful but necessary medicine, a form of intellectual surgery that cut away the diseased tissue of false certainty. It was a purification, a catharsis, that left the soul humbled, but also clean and ready for healing. The maeutics, then, was the healing itself. It was the process of helping the now healthy soul to generate its own strength, which for Socrates meant generating its own understanding. The goal was not necessarily to arrive at a final, perfect, unchanging definition of a virtue. The dialogues that Plato wrote often end without a firm conclusion. The true goal was the process itself, the shared, active, and honest pursuit of truth. The very activity of examining one's own beliefs, of questioning one's own life, was the path to living a good life. This was the brilliant two-part gift that Socrates offered to his fellow Athenians. He would first help them see that they were asleep, lost in a dream of false knowledge, and then he would offer to help them wake up. But waking up can be a jarring and unwelcome process, and many in Athens preferred to remain comfortably asleep. But not everyone in Athens preferred to remain comfortably asleep. Socrates' call to the examined life, his intense focus on virtue and the soul, did attract a following. He had no formal school like the academy that Plato would one day found. Instead, a loose circle of companions would gather around him in the agora or in private homes, drawn by his powerful intellect and his strange charisma. And it was the nature of these followers, particularly the city's most brilliant, wealthy, and ambitious young aristocrats, that would ultimately form the basis for the most dangerous charge ever laid against him, the corruption of the youth. And no single follower would cast a longer or darker shadow over Socrates' reputation than the most dazzling and dangerous young man in all of Athens, Alcibiades. Alcibiades was, by all accounts, a phenomenon. He seemed to have been blessed by the gods with every conceivable gift. He was extraordinarily handsome, possessed a quick and brilliant mind, and exuded an irresistible personal charm. He was also born into one of Athens's most noble and powerful families, and after his father was killed in battle, he was raised in the home of the great Pericles himself. He was the golden youth of the city, and all of Athens looked upon him with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, certain that his ambition would lead the city to either its greatest triumphs or its most devastating ruin. The bond between the old, plain-featured, barefoot philosopher and this radiant young aristocrat was a source of endless fascination and gossip in Athens. It was a relationship of intense philosophical affection. Socrates saw in Alcibiades not just a beautiful face, but a soul of immense and unique potential. He believed that a spirit so gifted could, if guided toward virtue, become the city's greatest benefactor. But he also saw that this same spirit, if left to its own devices and corrupted by the constant flattery and temptations that surrounded it, could become a force of immense destruction. Socrates saw it as his personal, philosophical mission to save the soul of Alcibiades from the very ambition that the rest of the city so admired. The most vivid portrait of their relationship comes from Plato's Symposium, in a speech given by Alcibiades himself. He bursts into a drinking party, drunk and emotional, and gives a speech not in praise of love, but in praise of Socrates. He describes the philosopher's almost magical effect on him. He admits that Socrates is the only person in the world who can make him feel shame for his own power-seeking, pleasure-driven life, and for neglecting the state of his own soul. He compares Socrates' words to the bite of a viper, a sting that goes straight to the heart and throws him into a state of crisis. Alcibiades confesses his inner torment. He is powerfully drawn to Socrates' vision of a virtuous life, but he is equally drawn to the roar of the crowd and the allure of political glory. He says he sometimes wishes Socrates were dead, because only then would he be free from the constant nagging call of his own conscience, which Socrates' presence awakened. This internal battle between philosophy and ambition would ultimately be won by ambition. Alcibiades' political career was as spectacular as his personality, and just as destructive. It was his powerful rhetoric that was a major force in persuading the Athenians to embark on the disastrous Sicilian expedition. Then, on the very eve of the fleet's departure, he became the primary suspect in a major religious scandal involving the profanation of sacred mysteries and the mutilation of religious statues. Recalled from the expedition to stand trial, he chose instead to defect. He fled to Sparta, Athens' mortal enemy, and proceeded to give the Spartans crucial strategic advice that led to several major Athenian defeats. His betrayals did not end there. After falling out of favor in Sparta, he fled to the Persian Empire, Athens' other great foe, and served as an advisor there. In a stunning series of reversals, he would eventually maneuver his way back into the service of Athens, securing several naval victories as a general before political intrigue once again forced him into exile, where he was eventually assassinated. He was a man of transcendent gifts who, lacking the self-knowledge and virtue that Socrates tried to instill in him, brought ruin to himself and his city. For the enemies of Socrates, the story of Alcibiades was the perfect weapon. The logic was simple and emotionally powerful. Look, they could say, at the philosopher's most famous and intimate associate. He became a sacrilegious traitor, a man who mocked the gods and sold out his city to the enemy. What else could he have learned from Socrates but arrogance, a contempt for the laws and traditions of the city, and a belief that he, as a superior individual, was above the common morality? The charge that Socrates corrupted the youth found its most potent and devastating evidence in the spectacular downfall of the city's golden boy. The spectacular treason of Alcibiades provided a powerful emotional argument for those who wished to cast Socrates as a corrupting influence. But he was not the only associate from the philosopher's past whose actions would be laid at his door. There was another man in his circle, an intellectual and an aristocrat, whose name would become even more hated in Athens than that of Alcibiades. This man was Critias, and he would not just betray the democracy. He would, for a time, utterly destroy it. Critias was a figure of towering intellect and ambition. A wealthy aristocrat, a respected poet and playwright, and a political theorist, he was also, in a twist of fate, a cousin of Plato's mother. Like Alcibiades, he had spent time in Socrates' circle, drawn to the philosopher's sharp mind and his critique of the democratic establishment. But where Alcibiades' flaws were those of a reckless and charming opportunist, Critias were of a colder, more ruthless, and more ideological nature. He came to believe that the masses were unfit to rule and that power rightly belonged to a small elite of the best and brightest. His moment to put this theory into practice came in 404 BC, when Sparta imposed its puppet government on the defeated city of Athens. Critias emerged as the undisputed leader of the 30 tyrants. He was the architect of their reign of terror, the driving force behind the executions, the property confiscations, and the climate of fear that gripped the city. It was Critias who likely orchestrated the order for the arrest of Leon of Salamis, the very order that Socrates had so bravely disobeyed. There could be no starker contrast. The former associate of Socrates, Critias, was now commanding the state to commit murder, while Socrates himself was risking his own life by refusing to participate. In fact, during his short and brutal rule, Critias and the 30 passed a law specifically forbidding the teaching of the art of words, a move aimed squarely at Socrates. The tyrants, it seemed, saw the philosopher's relentless questioning as a threat to their own authority. But this nuance would be lost on the restored democracy. After the tyrants were overthrown, the Athenians remembered only one thing. Critias, the city's most hated mass murderer, had been a member of Socrates' circle. The case against the philosopher now seemed overwhelming. His associates included the city's greatest traitor and its most brutal tyrant. To his enemies, this was no coincidence. It was a clear pattern, and the inescapable conclusion was that Socrates' philosophy was a school for tyrants, a poison that eroded respect for the law and the people. But this dark picture is incomplete. To see only Alcibiades and Critias is to ignore the other path that one could take after listening to Socrates. There was another young, wealthy aristocrat in his circle, a man who, like Critias, came from a distinguished political family and was expected to have a great future in public life. This young man was Plato. Plato was initially drawn to Socrates for the same reasons as the others: the power of his intellect and the force of his personality. He had planned to embark on a political career, to take his place among the leaders of the city. But his association with Socrates profoundly changed him. He saw in his master not a path to worldly power, but a path to a different, more important kind of life, a life of self-examination and the pursuit of virtue. And then, he witnessed the trial and execution of the man he called the wisest, most just, and best of all the men he had ever known. The death of Socrates was the defining event of Plato's life. It filled him with a deep and enduring disgust for the messy, unjust, and often violent world of practical politics. He saw that the democracy had, in a fit of ignorance and fear, killed its wisest citizen. He turned away from the political career he had been preparing for. He realized that the problem was not simply a matter of bad leaders, but that the entire foundation of the state was flawed if it could lead to such an injustice. Instead of seeking power, Plato dedicated his immense genius to a different task: to honor the memory of his teacher and to continue his mission. He left Athens for a time, and when he returned, he founded a school, the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. And he began to write. He wrote a series of brilliant dialogues, philosophical dramas in which his beloved master, Socrates, was the central hero. Through these dialogues, he not only preserved the Socratic method for all of history, but he also spent the rest of his life exploring the very questions that Socrates had died for. What is true justice? What is knowledge? What is the ideal state, governed not by opinion and emotion, but by reason and truth? The contrast could not be more dramatic. Critias and Plato. Both were gifted aristocrats. Both were associates of Socrates. One man listened to Socrates' critique of existing society and used it as a justification to seize absolute power and murder his fellow citizens. The other man listened to the very same critique and was inspired to renounce worldly power and dedicate his life to the quiet, patient, and unending search for wisdom. Socrates' teaching, it turned out, was not a doctrine or a political program. It was a mirror that revealed the true nature of the soul that encountered it. For a soul bent on tyranny, it provided a sharper tool. For a soul bent on wisdom, it provided a guiding light. This mirror that Socrates held up to the souls of his companions revealed the very best and the very worst of their characters. But for the vast majority of Athenians who were not his close associates, the view was far less nuanced. They did not see a man seeking virtue in others. They saw a bizarre and irritating figure who relentlessly questioned everything they held dear. For decades, through his daily activities in the agora, Socrates had been unintentionally conducting a masterclass in how to make enemies. And this slow, steady accumulation of hatred, across all sectors of society, was creating a dangerously combustible atmosphere around him. In his final speech at his trial, Socrates himself would identify the three main groups of people he had systematically offended during his divine mission to understand the oracle. First, there were the politicians. These were the men who guided the city, who proposed the laws and swayed the assembly with their speeches. A reputation for wisdom was their most valuable political currency. Socrates, with his polite but relentless questioning, had publicly demonstrated time and time again that this reputation was unfounded. He showed that these men, who spoke with such confidence about justice, honor, and the good of the state, could not provide a coherent account of these concepts when pressed. He made them look foolish in front of their peers and, most importantly, in front of the ambitious young men whose admiration they sought. Their hatred for him was not philosophical. It was personal and deeply political. Next, there were the poets. In ancient Athens, the great poets were more than just entertainers. They were seen as the moral teachers of the city. The tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles were considered profound explorations of the human condition, and the verses of Homer were the foundation of every schoolboy's education. When Socrates questioned them, he discovered that they created their works from a powerful inspiration they could not explain. But by demonstrating that they could not give a rational account of the wisdom their own poems contained, he was seen as challenging their very authority. He was subordinating their divine inspiration to his own dry, logical form of inquiry. To the poets and their admirers, this felt like an act of profound arrogance, an attempt to clip the wings of art with the shears of a cold and dissecting reason. Finally, there were the craftsmen. Socrates often expressed admiration for these men, as they were the only group who possessed a genuine practical knowledge of their trade. But he also found that their pride in their specific skill often led them to believe they were wise in all other matters as well. He had shown them, through his questioning, that the skill of being a good carpenter did not automatically translate into the skill of being a good man or a good citizen. This distinction, which was central to his philosophy, was taken as an insult by many proud artisans. He was, in their eyes, an idle man who produced nothing tangible, yet who presumed to lecture them on the limits of their wisdom. On top of the resentment from these three powerful groups, there was the widespread misunderstanding of the general public. Most Athenians never had a deep conversation with Socrates. Their perception of him was shaped by rumor, gossip, and most powerfully by public caricature. In 423 BC, nearly a quarter of a century before his trial, the city's greatest comic playwright, Aristophanes, staged his famous play, The Clouds. The play's main character was a bumbling, amoral, and ridiculous philosopher named Socrates. This fictional Socrates was a composite of all the intellectual trends that traditional Athenians found suspicious. He was portrayed as an atheist who denied the existence of the traditional gods and instead worshipped a new divine force called the clouds. He was shown running a thinkery, where he engaged in pointless scientific speculation, like measuring how far a flea could jump. Most damagingly, he was lumped in with the Sophists, portrayed as a charlatan who, for a fee, taught young men clever rhetorical tricks to make unjust arguments defeat just ones, the so-called art of making the weaker argument the stronger. This brilliant and hilarious caricature was a massive success. And for thousands of Athenians, this fictional character was the real Socrates. the false but memorable image of the money-grubbing, lot-wisting, atheist sophist stuck to him for the rest of his life. All these streams of animosity, the personal hatred of the politicians, the wounded pride of the poets, the quiet resentment of the craftsmen, and the broad, misinformed suspicion of the general public, were now converging. In a city traumatized by war, plague, and tyranny, Socrates' constant questioning no longer seemed like a healthy intellectual exercise. To many, it looked like a purely destructive force, a corrosive acid eating away at the foundations of tradition, religion, and social order. A perfect storm of hatred had gathered around this one singular man. The city, in its fragile state, desperately needed a scapegoat for all its troubles, and Socrates, the man who belonged to no party and questioned them all, was the perfect candidate. This perfect storm of animosity, which had been gathering for over a generation, was finally ready to break. The setting for the final act of Socrates' life would be the newly restored Athenian democracy. But this was not the triumphant, self-assured city of his youth. It was a state haunted by the ghosts of its recent past, a community walking on a knife's edge between reconciliation and revenge. The final confrontation was not just with a man, but with the memory and trauma of all that Athens had lost. In 403 BC, the democratic forces that had fled the city successfully overthrew the 30 tyrants and re-established the old constitution. But the city they inherited was a shadow of its former self. Its empire was gone, its treasury was empty, its defensive walls were in ruins, and its population had been decimated by war and civil strife. A deep wound had been carved into the city's soul. An entire generation had been lost, and the remaining citizens were divided by suspicion and grief. There was a pervasive sense that Athens had somehow lost its way, that it had abandoned the traditional virtues of piety and discipline that had once made it great, and that its catastrophic defeat was a form of divine punishment for this moral failing. To prevent the city from collapsing into an endless cycle of revenge killings, the restored democracy passed a remarkably forward-thinking decree, a general amnesty. This was a law of not remembering wrongs, which promised that no citizen could be prosecuted for political crimes committed during the reign of the 30. It was a pragmatic and necessary act to heal the fractured city, but it left the deep desire for justice and retribution simmering just beneath the surface. Old enemies still lived side by side, and while the law prevented direct political attacks, it could not erase the bitterness and the blame. It was in this climate that many Athenians began to search for a deeper cause for their misfortunes. The question on everyone's mind was, how did this happen to us? If the city had fallen so far, it was not just because of a military mistake or a bad political decision. It must have been because of a spiritual sickness, a moral corruption that had weakened the city from within. They were looking for the source of this corruption. And for a powerful coalition of his enemies, the answer was obvious. The source was the strange, endlessly questioning philosopher who had for so long been a fixture of their city. The attack was initiated by 3 men, each representing one of the core groups that Socrates had managed to alienate. The man who officially filed the legal indictment was a young, ambitious, and largely unknown poet named Miletus, likely acting on behalf of the offended artists and poets. He was joined by a man named Lyco, a professional orator who represented the rhetoricians whose art Socrates had so often criticized as being indifferent to the truth. But the real driving force behind the prosecution, the man with the political power and personal conviction to see it through, was Anytus. Anytus was one of the most respected and influential men in the restored democracy. A wealthy tanner by trade, he had been a leading general of the democratic forces that had overthrown the 30. He was a staunch conservative, a patriot who deeply believed that the salvation of Athens lay in a return to its old traditions, its respect for its political leaders, and its piety toward the gods. In his eyes, Socrates, with his constant questioning and his influence over the youth, represented a profound threat to this fragile social order. Anytus also held a bitter personal grudge. His own son had become a follower of Socrates, and Anytus blamed the philosopher for turning the boy against a future in the family business and filling his head with what he considered useless philosophical questions. The amnesty meant that Anytus and his allies could not prosecute Socrates for his association with Critias. That would be a political crime. So they crafted their charges with brilliant and lethal precision, bypassing the amnesty entirely. They did not accuse him of a specific action, but of a lifetime of corrupting influence. The formal indictment, sworn by Miletus, read, "Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and of introducing new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded is death." These charges were a masterstroke of legal strategy. They were vague, spiritual, and almost impossible to disprove. They allowed the prosecution to put his entire life on trial. The charge of impiety could be linked to his strange, private daimonion, and the charge of corrupting the youth was the perfect vessel into which they could pour all the popular resentment against him. It allowed them to bring up the notorious careers of Alcibiades and Critias, not as political collaborators, but as prime examples of the moral corruption his teaching produced. Socrates was not to be tried as a political enemy, but as the spiritual poison that had caused the moral decay of Athens itself. The stage was now set for the city to finally silence its gadfly. The day of the trial arrived. 501 Athenian citizens, chosen by lot from the public rolls, took their seats on wooden benches to serve as judge and jury. There was no professional magistrate to interpret the law, no skilled lawyers to argue the points of the case. The verdict would rest entirely in the hands of this massive assembly of ordinary men. Farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and veterans. Anytus, Miletus, and Lyco came forward to present their case. They spoke for 3 hours, weaving a narrative that mixed half-truths with outright slander, skillfully appealing to the jurors' patriotism, their piety, and their deep-seated fears. They would have painted Socrates as an arrogant elitist who looked down on the common man, an atheist who undermined the city's religion, and a sophist whose teachings had directly produced the traitor Alcibiades and the tyrant Critias. They presented him as a sickness in the city's soul, and they demanded the penalty of death. Then it was Socrates' turn to speak. The 70-year-old man rose to face his accusers and his fellow citizens. The jury likely expected the usual kind of defense. They expected a defendant to flatter them, to make emotional appeals, perhaps even to weep and beg for mercy. Socrates did none of these things. From the very first words of his speech, which Plato would later record as the Apology, a title that in Greek means a formal defense, not an expression of regret, he made it clear that he would not play by their rules. He began by immediately dismissing the tools of his accusers. He told the jury that he would not use the polished, flowery, and often deceptive language of the professional orators. He was not an expert in the ways of the court, he said, and he would speak to them only in the same plain, direct language he had used his entire life in the agora. His only ally, he declared, would be the truth. He then made a crucial argument. The formal charges brought by Anytus and Miletus were not the real threat. The true danger, he insisted, came from the older, unspoken accusations, the prejudices and slanders that had been accumulating against him for decades. He was fighting against shadows, against the powerful but false public image of him created by rumor and, most powerfully, by Aristophanes' comedy. He took great care to dismantle this caricature, insisting that he was not a sophist, that he had never taken money for teaching, and that he did not speculate about things in the heavens or below the earth. Only then did he turn to the formal charges. To explain his life of questioning, he retold the story of his friend Chaerephon and the Delphic oracle. He framed his entire philosophical life not as an act of personal arrogance, but as a pious mission, a religious duty he had undertaken to understand the God's word. It was in the course of this divine service, he explained, that he had exposed the ignorance of the powerful and earned their hatred. He was not an enemy of the state, but its greatest benefactor. It was here that he introduced his famous metaphor. Athens, he said, was a great and noble horse, who because of its very size had become lazy and sluggish. He, Socrates, was a gadfly, sent by the god to attach himself to the horse, to sting and irritate it, to awaken it from its comfortable sleep of unthinking self-satisfaction. "And if you kill me," he warned them, "you will not easily find another like me. You will harm yourselves more than you will harm me." In a moment of extraordinary audacity, he even demonstrated his famous method right there in the courtroom. He called his chief accuser, Miletus, to stand and be questioned. In a brief but brilliant cross-examination, Socrates tied the young poet in logical knots, exposing the carelessness and the inherent contradictions of the charges he had brought. He made the prosecutor, the man who claimed to be a great defender of the youth, look like a fool who had never given any serious thought to the nature of education or piety. Finally, he addressed the unspoken expectation that he should beg for his life. In Athenian trials, it was common and often effective for a defendant to bring his weeping wife and young children before the jury, to parade his misery and appeal to their pity. Socrates explicitly and adamantly refused to do so. He argued that such a spectacle would be a disgrace to himself, to the court, and to the city of Athens. He had lived his life with dignity and reason, and he would not abandon them now. He insisted that the juror's duty was not to grant favors based on emotion, but to deliver a just verdict based on the laws and the evidence. By refusing to beg, he was paying them the highest respect, treating them as rational judges, not as an emotional mob to be manipulated. It was an act of profound, almost stubborn integrity. But to many of the jurors, in a court that ran on convention and emotion, it likely came across as the ultimate proof of his arrogance. When Socrates finished his defense, having offered not a plea for mercy but a justification of his entire life, a silence fell over the court. The time for speeches was over. Now, the 501 jurors had to render their judgment. Each man stood, took his 2 bronze ballots, one with a solid hub for acquittal, one with a hollow hub for conviction, and walked past 2 urns. He would drop the ballot representing his vote into the first urn, and the unused ballot into the second. The city, in the form of these men, was about to pass judgment on its own conscience. The ballots were counted. The herald stepped forward to announce the result. Socrates was found guilty, but the margin was astonishingly narrow. 280 jurors had voted for conviction. 221 had voted for acquittal. A swing of just 30 votes would have set him free. Socrates himself, upon hearing the tally, expressed his surprise. He had expected a much larger majority against him. For a moment, it seemed that his appeal to reason had almost succeeded. Despite decades of prejudice, despite the powerful political forces arrayed against him, nearly half the jury had not been persuaded of his guilt. But the trial was not over. The Athenian legal system now entered its second phase. The prosecution had already proposed its penalty: death. It was now the defendant's right to propose a counter-penalty. The jury would then hold a second vote, with no further debate, to choose between the 2 options. This was Socrates' chance to save his own life. The path was clear and conventional. He was expected to propose a reasonable alternative that the jury could accept. A heavy fine, paid by his wealthy friends, was a possibility. The most common and expected proposal in such a case, however, was exile. By agreeing to leave Athens forever, he would satisfy his enemies and give the jurors a way to punish him without having to execute a fellow citizen. But Socrates would not take the easy path. He had refused to compromise his principles in his defense, and he would not do so now in the face of death. He rose to make his counter-proposal, and what he said next would seal his fate. He began not by suggesting a punishment, but by calmly assessing what he believed he truly deserved. He reminded the jury of his life's mission, his service as the gadfly of the state, a gift from the god to awaken them to the pursuit of virtue. For this service, he argued, he did not deserve a penalty at all. He deserved an honor. And so, with an act of supreme and breathtaking irony, he made his formal counter-proposal, that he be given free meals for the rest of his life in the Prytaneum, the sacred public hall where the city honored its Olympic champions, its greatest generals, and its most revered benefactors. A wave of shock and outrage must have swept through the jury. He was not just defying them. He was openly mocking the very process of the court. He was claiming the highest honor in the city as his punishment. After this act of defiance, he briefly considered the other options, only to dismiss them. A prison sentence? No free man should volunteer for that. A fine? He stated that he was a poor man and could only afford a token amount, though he then amended this, saying that his friends Plato, Crito, and others had offered to put up a large sum of 30 minae on his behalf, and so he reluctantly proposed that. What about exile? He rejected it utterly. He told the jurors that if his own people could not endure his words and his questioning, why should he expect the people of any other city to do so? He would only be driven from town to town by angry fathers and resentful leaders. And what if he were to go elsewhere and live a quiet life of silence? He dismissed this with what would become the single most famous statement of his entire life, the motto of all Western philosophy: Hoda anexatastos bios ou biotos anthropoi, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. The jury had been given a choice. On the one hand, the death penalty proposed by the prosecution. On the other, Socrates' insulting proposal of a reward, later amended to a fine they likely felt he was not serious about. There was no longer any middle ground, no honorable compromise of exile. Enraged by his perceived arrogance, many of the jurors who had voted to acquit him in the first round now switched their votes in anger. The second vote was taken. This time the result was not close. A much larger majority, some 80 jurors more than before, voted to condemn him to death. The sentence was passed. Socrates was to die by drinking a cup of hemlock. He spoke one final time, not with anger or despair, but with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout. He first addressed those who had condemned him, not with a curse, but with a prophecy. He warned them that by killing him, they had not silenced criticism. Instead, they would now be faced with a host of younger, harsher critics, his own followers, who would rise up to question them in his place. Then he turned to those who had voted to acquit him, his friends on the jury, and he offered them comfort. He told them not to fear for him, and not to see his death as an evil thing. He explained that his divine sign, his daimonion, which had so often stopped him from taking a wrong step, had been completely silent throughout the entire day's proceedings. He took this as a sign that what was happening to him was, in fact, a good thing. For death, he reasoned, must be one of two things. Either it is a state of nothingness, a deep and dreamless sleep, which would be a wonderful gain, or it is a journey of the soul from this world to another. And if it is a journey, he mused, what could be better than to arrive in a place where one could converse with the great heroes, poets, and thinkers of the past? His work of questioning would not end. It would finally truly begin. Socrates' final words to the jury showed a man at peace with his fate, a philosopher ready to face death without fear. But his journey to that end would not be immediate. An ancient Athenian religious custom would intervene, granting him one final month of life. Every year, the city sent a sacred ship on a ceremonial voyage to the holy island of Delos, and an old law forbade any public executions from the time the ship was crowned for its departure until it returned. By chance, the ship had been crowned the day before Socrates' trial. This meant he would have to wait in the state prison for weeks, a delay that, for his devoted friends, was not a simple reprieve. It was a window of opportunity, a last desperate chance to save him from what they saw as the city's terrible injustice. No one was more determined to seize this chance than his oldest and wealthiest friend, a man named Crito. Long before the sun had risen one morning, Crito made his way into Socrates' prison cell. He had used his considerable fortune to bribe the guards, ensuring this private meeting. He found the 70-year-old philosopher sleeping with a calm and peaceful expression, and he sat for a long while in the darkness, overwhelmed by his own anxiety and grief. Crito was a good and loyal man, but he was a man of the world, a pragmatist. He had come with a detailed and entirely workable plan. A ship was ready, a safe and welcoming exile had been arranged in the region of Thessaly, and there was more than enough money to ensure the cooperation of everyone who needed to be paid. Only one obstacle remained: convincing Socrates to accept. When Socrates finally awoke, Crito, his voice full of urgency and emotion, laid out his plan and began to plead. He did not make a single argument, but a volley of them, each one designed to appeal to reason, to friendship, and to duty. First, he appealed to his own reputation and that of all of Socrates' friends. If Socrates died, Crito argued, the world would not only believe that his friends had lost a companion like no other, but also that they had been too cheap or too cowardly to arrange his escape. Their honor would be stained forever by the shame of having abandoned him. Next, he argued that by staying, Socrates was actively collaborating with the injustice of his enemies. He was choosing to help them carry out their wicked plan. To save himself, therefore, would not be an act of cowardice, but an act of justice, a refusal to participate in their crime. He was, Crito insisted, betraying the very cause of justice he had championed his entire life. Finally, Crito unleashed his most powerful argument: duty to family. He reminded Socrates of his 3 sons, who would now be left as orphans. By choosing death, Socrates was abandoning his most fundamental responsibility as a father, to raise and educate his children. He was taking the easy way out, Crito argued, leaving his sons to drift through life without a father's guidance. Socrates listened to this torrent of practical, emotional, and compelling arguments with his usual patience. When Crito had finished, the philosopher did not respond with equal passion. Instead, he gently but firmly swept aside all of Crito's concerns about money, reputation, and the opinion of the majority. For Socrates, these were irrelevant distractions. The only question that mattered, he insisted, the only question a good man should ever ask, was this: would it be a just and honorable act for me to escape, or would it be an unjust one? To answer this, Socrates asked Crito to join him in one last crucial thought experiment. He asked him to imagine that just as they were about to slip out of the prison, they were confronted by a living embodiment of the laws and the state of Athens. He gave a voice to these personified laws, which began to question him. "Tell us, Socrates," the laws would say, "what are you attempting to do? By this act of yours, are you not planning to destroy us, the laws, and the whole city, as far as it is in your power to do so? Do you think that a state can continue to exist if the decisions of its courts have no force, and can be nullified and destroyed by private individuals?" The laws then reminded him of their role in his life. "Was it not through us that your father married your mother and brought you into the world? Did we not provide for your upbringing and your education?" They cast themselves as his parent and his teacher, to whom he owed a duty of respect far greater than that owed to a mother or father. Finally, the laws made their most powerful argument, the first great articulation of the concept of a social contract. "We gave you the choice, Socrates, like every other Athenian citizen. For 70 years you have lived in our city. If you did not approve of us, you were free at any time to take your property and leave. You have not only stayed, you have left the city less often than the lame and the blind. You have shown by your actions that you are more satisfied with us than any other Athenian. By choosing to live here, You have entered into a tacit agreement to obey our commands. Are you now, at the end of your life, going to break that sacred pact? You claim that the city has done you an injustice. But have we ever taught you that it is right to answer an injury with another injury? You, who have spoken your whole life about virtue, will you now try to destroy us, your nurturers? For that is what you are doing by running away. When Socrates finished relaying this imaginary speech, he turned to his friend. He explained that these words, the arguments of the laws, were echoing in his soul so loudly, like the music of a divine flute, that he could hear nothing else. He was bound not by the stone walls of the prison, but by the unbreakable chains of his own argument. Crito, moved and defeated by the profound logic of his friend, had nothing more to say. The decision was made. Socrates would not escape. Crito fell silent, and with his silence, the last worldly argument for Socrates' survival was laid to rest. The path was now irrevocably set. For the remaining time, which stretched to nearly a month, as the sacred ship made its slow journey to Delos and back, Socrates remained in his prison. His chains were removed, and his friends were allowed to visit him daily. They came every morning, and they found him not in a state of despair, but as he had always been, calm, thoughtful, and eager to engage in conversation. Then, one afternoon, news arrived that the ship from Delos had been sighted off the coast. The next day would be his last. His friends gathered in his cell from the early hours of the morning on that final day. They found him with Xanthippe and their youngest son. But on this day, the atmosphere was heavy with a grief that could no longer be restrained. His friends, men like the devoted Apollodorus and Phaedo, who would later recount the day's events, were struggling to hold back their tears. Socrates alone was serene, almost cheerful. He gently chided his friends for their sadness, reminding them that he had sent the women of his family away precisely to avoid such displays of lamentation. A man, he said, should die in a state of tranquil peace. He spent his final hours not in silent reflection or prayer, but in doing the one thing he had dedicated his life to, engaging in a deep and searching philosophical conversation. His friends were weeping at the prospect of his death, but Socrates saw it as an opportunity for one final inquiry. The topic for his last day on earth was the immortality of the soul. He argued with his friends that a true philosopher has spent his entire life in a kind of training for death. The body, with its endless needs, desires, and distractions, is a prison for the soul. The true work of philosophy is to free the soul from this prison as much as possible, to purify it from bodily influences and to focus it on the pursuit of pure, eternal truths. Death, therefore, was not something to be feared. It was the final and complete liberation of the soul from the body. It was not an end, but a release, a moment the soul had been preparing for its entire life. He spoke not as a man trying to convince himself, but as one with a calm and reasoned confidence that he was not going to his destruction, but was instead embarking on a journey to a better and truer place. As the sun began to set, the time for the execution drew near. Socrates' final actions were marked by the same deliberate calm. He asked for his 3 sons and the women of his household to be brought to him. He spoke with them for a time, gave them his last instructions, and then gently sent them away. He then said he wished to take a bath. Crito asked why, and Socrates replied with a simple, practical kindness. He wished to save the women of his family the trouble of having to wash his corpse. When he returned from his bath, the sun was touching the horizon. The official of the court, the man responsible for administering the poison, entered the cell. But he did not enter with a harsh command. He was weeping. He approached Socrates and said that he knew Socrates was not angry with him, for he was only following orders. He told the philosopher that of all the men who had ever come to this prison, Socrates was the noblest, the gentlest, and the best. The executioner, his voice breaking, asked Socrates to bear his fate as easily as he could. then turned away, crying. Socrates looked at him with admiration for his decency. He comforted the man and assured him he would do as he said. He then turned to his friends and asked, "What do you say about making a libation, a drink offering to some god, from the cup?" When he was told that the dose was measured out with just enough to be fatal, he accepted this. "Well," he said, "at least I can, and I must, pray to the gods that my journey from this world to the next will be a fortunate one." And with that, he raised the cup to his lips. Without any sign of hesitation, without trembling or changing color or expression, he steadily and cheerfully drank the poison down. At this sight, his friends could no longer contain their grief. Crito had been trying to hold back his tears, but now he rose and walked away, sobbing. Apollodorus, who had been crying all day, let out a loud and painful wail. The sound broke the resolve of everyone else in the room, and they all broke down in tears. Only Socrates remained calm. He gently rebuked them. "What is this strange outcry?" he asked. "I sent the women away mainly so that they would not misbehave in this way, for I have been told that a man should die in peace. Be quiet and control yourselves." Ashamed, his friends fell silent. Socrates did as he had been instructed, walking about the cell until his legs began to feel heavy. Then he lay down on his back. The man who had administered the poison periodically checked his feet and legs, pinching them, noting how the cold and numbness were slowly spreading upwards toward his heart. A moment later, Socrates stirred one last time. He uncovered his face and spoke his final words, not of philosophy, but of a simple, mysterious debt. He said to his oldest friend, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please do not forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the Greek god of healing and medicine. It was the custom for those who had recovered from a serious illness to sacrifice a rooster to the god in thanks for their cure. With these final words, Socrates was offering his last philosophical lesson. Life itself, he was implying, is a kind of long sickness, a fever of the body. Death was not a tragedy. It was the ultimate cure, the final healing that released the pure soul. Moments later, he was gone. Crito gently closed Socrates' eyes and mouth. There was no reply to his last question. This was the end of their friend, the man whom they would later remember as being, of all the men of their time they had known, the wisest, the most just, and the best. The state official covered his face. The city of Athens had finally silenced its gadfly. The relentless, questioning voice that had echoed through the agora for decades was gone. But in the quiet grief of that prison cell, something new was beginning. In killing the man, Athens had unintentionally given birth to a legend. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, his followers were frightened and rudderless. They had just witnessed the state kill their mentor for the crime of thinking, and they feared that they, as his close associates, might be the next targets. Plato, it is said, was so horrified by the event that he and several other Socratics fled Athens for a time, seeking safety in the nearby city of Megara. For a moment, it may have seemed that the city's authorities had succeeded. The movement that had formed around Socrates was scattered. The voice was silenced, and his followers were in hiding. Later tradition holds that the city of Athens soon experienced a profound wave of regret for its actions. One ancient historian, Diogenes Laertius, wrote that the Athenians were overcome with such remorse that they closed the wrestling schools and gymnasia in mourning. He claims that they banished Socrates' accusers from the city and put Meletus to death, and that they commissioned a great bronze statue of Socrates, created by the famous sculptor Lysippus, to be placed in a place of honor. While the historical accuracy of these particular events is debated, the story itself reveals a deeper truth. The narrative of Socrates as a noble martyr, a wise man unjustly condemned by an ignorant mob, began to take hold very quickly. The city, even if it did not formally repent, would forever be defined by the memory of the man it had executed. But the true immortality of Socrates was not to be cast in bronze. It was to be written on the page. The real and lasting tribute to his life was the work of his most brilliant student. The execution of Socrates was the wound that forged Plato the philosopher. It shattered his youthful political ambitions and set him on a new course. He had witnessed the fall of the 30 tyrants and the failings of the restored democracy, and he came to a stark conclusion. The world of politics was fundamentally flawed. A state that could kill its best citizen was not a just state. And so, Plato dedicated the rest of his long life to a single monumental task: to build in words and ideas the world of justice and truth that his master had sought. To do this, he first had to preserve the memory of the man who had set him on this path. He began to write. He did not write a simple biography or a collection of his master's sayings. Instead, he did something far more profound. He resurrected him. In a series of brilliant philosophical dramas, known to history as the Platonic Dialogues, he made Socrates the central character. In these texts, Socrates lives again. He walks the streets of Athens. He questions the powerful. He unravels the contradictions of his conversation partners, and he relentlessly searches for the nature of virtue. Through the genius of Plato, the Socratic method was preserved not as a dry formula, but as a living, breathing, dramatic art form. Almost everything we know of Socrates' thought, his character, and his final days comes to us through the lens of Plato. He became the keeper of his master's flame. He founded his school, the Academy, to carry on the Socratic tradition of rigorous inquiry. And his dialogues ensured that the voice Athens had tried to silence with a cup of poison would instead become the foundational voice of the entire Western philosophical tradition. Other followers also carried his legacy forward in their own ways. Antisthenes, inspired by Socrates' self-sufficiency and indifference to convention, founded the school of the Cynics. Aristippus, fascinated by his master's self-control, developed a philosophy of rational pleasure. His influence was not a single doctrine, but a seed that, once planted, grew into many different and often competing philosophical trees. He had not given his followers a set of answers to live by. He had given them a method for questioning, a commitment to the examined life that would shape the intellectual history of the world. The man was gone, but the questions he had unleashed, the fundamental questions of how we ought to live, would never be silenced again.